Hello everybody, so this is a knit through of the beginner's beanie. So first let's talk about yarn. This pattern is written for a bulky yarn weight. So I've got a couple different examples here. Some are merino, some are acrylic. You can use any kind of yarn that you want as long as it's bulky yarn. So the way that you can tell is you will look at the tags. It will say what it's made out of, how many yards there are, how much it weighs, and then it'll tell you the suggested needle size. So here it says a US 10 to 11, so that is chunky. On this one here, it looks a little different. Here is the info, and then here it says an 8mm or US 11. Needle sizes are written both in millimeter and US and UK as well, but it really varies. Some people prefer millimeter, some people prefer US, but it ends up being the same thing. And then on this yarn here, again, it gives all the information about the yarn on the back. This one actually says that it's bulky weight. And then it tells you that it suggests that you use a US 9 5.5mm. So any yarn that you find that has a bulky weight will work for this pattern. All right, so let's talk really quick about the supplies that you're gonna need for your hat. To knit the brim, the bottom part of the hat, you want it to be a little tighter than the rest of the hat so it'll stay on comfortably. You are gonna want a US 8, which is a 5mm 16-inch circular needle. That 16 inches refers to the length of this cord. So a US 8 or 5mm needle. And then for the body of the hat, which is going to be a little bit bigger, you'll need a US 10 6mm 16-inch needle. And needles come with all kinds of different cord sizes, but this is going to be the best size for a hat specifically. You can get one with a bigger cord and use magic loop, but I don't recommend it as that is just harder to figure out. When you get to the end of your hat, you are going to, there's going to be too few stitches for you to reach all the way around here. So what you're going to have to do is transfer them to double pointed needles. So you will need size 6mm US 10 double pointed needles, and later in the tutorial I'll show you how these work. You will need a stitch marker so that you can tell where you are in the pattern. As you'll knit around, you want to know when you get to the end. And if you don't have a specific stitch marker, you can throw a ring on there, you can tie a piece of yarn, you can really use anything you want. You are going to want to have a threading needle. They make these sort of large tipped dull needles, and these are what you'll use to thread in the yarn when you finish your hat. And then having a pair of scissors is also handy so you can trim yarn. Any kind of scissors will work. These are just what I happen to have, but any scissor that you have in your house will do. I'm going to start with my smaller needle size, so the US 8 5mm circular needle, and first I'm going to cast on my yarn. So you take the end that is not connected to the ball, and I pull about 3 arm lengths of yarn. You don't want to run out of yarn, so it's better to have a little extra than having too little. So you can see I have a tutorial that you can see on my page that is more detailed about how to cast on. So what you're going to do is you're going to hold, this is the end that is not connected to the ball, and this is the side that's connected to the ball. I hold them under my fingers like this, around the thumb and pointer finger. You push down in the middle, you come through that loop and grab the one at the top and pull it through. So like I said, you can see my tutorial to see this with more detail and slower. So I'm going to just start casting on. So I'm doing the women's medium, so I'm going to cast on 72 stitches. Some people prefer to count as they go. That's what I personally do. Some people prefer to do, 10, 20, 30 at a time and then count like that. It's really up to you. Put on a few here as an example of how you'll count them. You have stitch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I'm going to continue until I get to 72 stitches, and then I'll show you how you connect the two ends. So I have finished casting on, and I have counted all the stitches to make sure that there are the correct number. On that last stitch, you're going to have one end that is not connected to the ball, and this one's a little longer than you want. You probably want it about 10 to 15 inches or so. That one is going to be set aside. We're not going to be knitting with that yarn. So when you start knitting, you want to make sure that you are knitting from the side that is connected to the ball of yarn. If not, you're just going to run out of yarn. So the first thing we want to do after counting to make sure we have the correct number of stitches is make sure that it isn't twisted. So you can see this row of stitches here should all be facing the inside. I like to pick a side, run my hand along the side, and double check that it's all facing inward. If it looks like this, you can see that it's twisting around. So I want to then just rotate it back so everything is on the inside. So before we start knitting, what we want to do is take our stitch marker and we want to put it onto that right needle. The right needle is going to be the needle that we knit with, which is often called the working needle. So you just slip it right on there, and each round, it's not connected into the yarn or anything. That is an option. You can put it in a stitch, but for knitting in the round specifically, it's easiest to just kind of slip it on there, and then you know when you got to the end. A lot of people like to start getting into the brim pattern immediately, but I think that because the first row is so much tighter and it's a little more difficult to knit, I prefer to just do knit stitches. I don't want to do any purl stitches. And I'll go over knit and purl stitches, but I have another video tutorial that you can check out that gives more detailed. Just for some reference, I knit with Continental. There are 2 different ways to knit. I recommend that people learn Continental. It seems a little more confusing, but it gives you better tension, so the yarn in the hat is more evenly distributed. It's a lot faster to knit with, and it's a lot more comfortable, in my opinion. There's not as much hand moving around. So I'm going to come into this first stitch, and I'm going to go from below, and I'm going to wrap my yarn around my needle and pull it through. It's easy sometimes to get a little bit of a gap between the first and last stitch, and if that happens, don't worry about it too much. You can fix it at the end. But I want to try and pull that first stitch tight. So I'm going to continue to do the same thing. I'm going to put my stitch in through the bottom, pull the yarn through, and I'm going to do that all the way until I get to the end of the round. And you'll know that you have reached the end of the round because you will get back to that stitch marker that you placed. So just a little note as we're knitting on what the easiest way to do it is. I like to scrunch my stitches up toward the end of the left needle, and that way when I start to knit, they're easier to grab and they'll just kind of slide off the end. You want to make sure that you don't push them too far or they'll fall off, and that is super disappointing. It is fixable if you're farther into your knit, but especially when you're learning, it can be a pain in it. So as I've done more stitches here, you can see that on my right needle, the stitches are starting to bunch up, and this makes it harder to knit. So I take them and I just pull them back, and when I pull them back, I push some more forward here, and I keep doing that while I go around. That makes it easier to get the stitches, and it keeps them from getting too all jumbled up in one place. Get to the stitch marker, so I wanted to give you guys a demonstration of how that works. So I'm going to keep knitting until I get to the stitch marker. So here's the last stitch, and I'm going to do that one, and sometimes it can come a little bit loose, so I like to take the other end of the yarn and kind of pull that stitch tight. So in order to get this stitch marker to the other side, you can see it's not connected onto the yarn or anything. You can either pick it up with your needle and slip it over to the other side, but personally I prefer to take it, lift it up, and just set it there, and then you keep knitting. So now that we have done the first round, we are going to start doing the brim pattern. The brim pattern will depend on how many stitches you have and the pattern you're doing, but for this one, it is knit 2, purl 2. So you'll knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2 all the way around. So knit 1, knit 2, purl 1, purl 2, and again, if you want to see purl stitches done in detail, go check out the tutorial on them. Knit 1, knit 2, purl 1, purl 2. You also want to make sure to try and keep those purl stitches kind of tight. You want them to be as even as possible. So when I purl, after I pull it onto that needle, I'm going to kind of pull the yarn tight. So now we are going to keep doing knit 2, purl 2 until we get all the way around. So I am almost to the end after I've made that row, and one thing with hats is you can see it can kind of twist itself while you're knitting. As long as it's not twisted in the beginning, you'll be fine. It'll be easier once you get further, but I prefer to have this facing me. You can have it facing away from you too. You're knitting the exact same thing. If you do it that way, it'll look like you're knitting inside out, but it's just an illusion. Either way, you are actually knitting on the outside. So I'm about to get to the end, so I'm going to do my last set of knit 2 and purl 2. When you get to the end, you will have the opposite of what you started with. So since I started with knit stitches, I'm going to end with purl stitches. That way the pattern is going to go seamlessly around the whole thing, and you won't be able to tell where the end is. So I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to take this stitch marker and I'm going to slip it onto the other side, and then I'm going to keep going. So I'm going to knit 1, knit 2, purl 1, purl 2. So you're going to keep going as many times as the pattern specifies. For a single brim on bulky, that's usually about 10, and it'll be probably 20 something for a double brim. So I will check back in when I get there. I'm a little ways into the brim now, and I wanted to demonstrate what the different stitches look like. So these are knit stitches, and these right here are purl stitches. And essentially what they are is backwards versions of each other. So knit stitches will look like this on the front, but they'll look like purl stitches on the back. Purl stitches on this side will look like knit stitches on the back. So they're basically inside out versions of each other. So here when we have knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, you can see that it makes this nice pattern. The reason that we do a brim like this on the end of hats is because if you were to just do knit stitches, the yarn would start rolling up the brim, and that was a cool look in the 90s. It was super popular, but it's not exactly the most popular look today. So this brim keeps the yarn from rolling up and makes a nice clean edge to keep the hat securely on your head. We talked about counting stitches, which is across, but let's talk about counting rows, which is up and down. So you can see here that each stitch is defined by these little sections right here. So what you do is you start from the bottom, and sometimes with the bottom you kind of have to pull it down a little bit to see the stitch. So it doesn't matter where you count, you just have to stay in the same column while you count. So we have this first stitch down here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we have 10 rows here. So if we were doing a single brim, this is where you would stop, and you are welcome to do more or less rows to make it whatever length you want. This is sort of the general amount that most people do. You can also use a ruler and see how long it is. This is about 1.5 inches, almost 2 inches. So if you like a really tall brim, you can do taller. If you like a short brim, you can do shorter. As long as you do like 5 rows, then it won't curl up. So we have now finished the brim. I decided to do a double brim. So you can see if you fold this up, the amount on the outside is going to be half of the length of what's on the inside. So we've got the outside there, and then this is what it will look like on the inside. If you're doing a shorter brim, this process of transferring needles is going to be exactly the same. A break from your knitting, I like to push the yarn down so that it won't fall off the ends, but you can also get little plastic bits that cover the ends so they won't slide off, but usually I find it sufficient to just pull it down. That way there's no chance that it's going to go anywhere, and then I can just slide it back up when I'm ready to keep knitting. So what I like to do, these are little plastic pieces that keep the yarn from slipping off the end. I like to first transfer the stitch marker onto that needle, and then I will place that on the end. I'm now going to grab my US 10 6mm 16-inch needles, and I'm going to put a little stopper on one end. So there's kind of 2 ways to do this. One, you can slip all the stitches individually onto the next needle, but what I prefer is to just knit them onto the next needle. That saves you time, and it's not that difficult to do. It might seem a little weird at first, but it's not too bad. So I will push the yarn on that right needle back so that this isn't getting in the way, and I'll push the yarn on the left needle forward. And then I'm going to continue knitting the way that we did before. I'm just going to be knitting onto the other needle instead of this needle. So I will go through that first loop, grab the yarn, and pull it off. And since we are done with the brim, now we are just doing knit stitches, so I will be knitting the whole way. So I'm just going to continue to knit onto this next needle. And this needle can feel like it's kind of in the way. You can move it to however you prefer, whatever's comfortable. It'll seem a little weird at first, but then you'll get the hang of it. So I'm going to keep knitting the rest of this round until it is entirely on the new needle. All right, so I'm about to finish transferring onto this these last few stitches of the needle transfer. So sometimes stitches can get a little finicky. Don't stress too much about it. I will knit these stitches. And after that, this second needle will fall completely off. So I'll now have all of it on the size 10 needle. I'm going to grab the stitch marker from this other needle, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to place it onto the right needle so that I still know when I reach the center. And then you're just going to keep knitting until you get to the top of your head, which is when you start to close. So I will check back in after I've knit the body of the hat. From here on, we're just going to do straight knit stitches around and around, no purl stitches. I have finished the body of my hat. I have my brim folded up, which you can adjust to shorter or longer. And then I am now going to start decreasing. It's going to be different for everyone when you start decreasing, and the best test generally is to just try it on and see how it fits. So when you get to this point, you can see that it is just starting to reach the crown of my head. So that's when you're gonna stop. This hat closes relatively slow compared to some hats, which close really fast. So in other hats, you're gonna want it to be a little taller. It just varies. This is also the point where you can add slouch if you want your hat to have more sort of slouchiness that comes down in the back. You can knit a little further. And don't stress too much about your first hat if it's perfect or not. The good thing with knitting is that you can always just take it apart and start over. So let's do a practice round. So the pattern says to knit 5, then knit 2 together. So we're gonna knit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then for a knit 2 together, instead of just going through 1 stitch, you're going to go through 2 stitches and knit both of those together. So it's the same thing, you're just going through 2 stitches instead of 1. So now we're going to do that same pattern again. Knit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, knit 2 together. So now these 2 stitches have become 1 stitch. So we're going to keep doing the pattern, and it's a decrease row, a knit row, a decrease row, a knit row. So it'll start getting smaller and smaller every other row. So I'm going to continue doing that, and then I will check in with you when I'm ready to close the hat. So we have just reached the point where if you look at the stitches on the circular needles, there aren't enough stitches to continue decreasing. It'll get too tight and you won't be able to knit the next stitch. So that means it is now time for us to transfer to our double pointed needles so that we can finish closing the hat. So what I like to do is take this stitch marker off, and so that I still remember where the end of the round is, I will take it and I will just place it on a stitch right here. It doesn't really matter which one you place it on. You'll know when you get to the end of the needle that has that near it. And then I like to put a little stopper on the end just to make sure they don't fall off. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start knitting onto the next needles. The round that I'm about to do is knit 2 together. So I'm going to follow the pattern, but I'm just going to knit onto this needle instead. So I'll knit 1, make sure you pull the first one nice and tight, knit 2, knit 2 together, knit 1, knit 2, knit 2 together. So you can knit however far you want onto the needle. When you're ready to end that needle, I like to do about 1/3 of the stitches. I usually do them onto 3 different needles. I'll push it to the middle, set that aside, and then I will grab my next needle and keep knitting. And I usually like to do it right after I did a 2 together. So then I'll start at the beginning again, knit 1, knit 2, knit 2 together. And you'll keep going like that until you have all the stitches transferred onto the double pointed needles. When you have finished transferring onto the double pointed needles, this is what it looks like. It doesn't matter exactly how many stitches are in each needle, but I know that I finished the round at the end of this needle because I have the stitch marker here. So now you'll just keep knitting around. You use an extra needle to continue to knit off each needle. So you'll basically be swapping out needles as you go. So I'm now on a knit row, so I'm just going to knit all the stitches. That needle comes out, that needle stays there, and then you start knitting with that needle onto the next needle. It can be a little bit confusing at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's really simple. You can also use the magic loop method. I personally don't prefer to use that method, but it also works, and it's up to you what you'd like to do and what you feel more comfortable doing. So we have now gotten to where we are ready to close our hat. So what we're going to do is we are going to take this string and we're going to cut about 10 inches or so of leftover yarn, and we're going to use that to close it and to sew in the ends. This is the part where I will usually remove the stitch markers since we don't need it anymore, and I will now grab my tapestry needle. I'm going to thread this yarn through the tapestry needle. I like to fold it over thread it through and pull it out so that it goes in one side and out the other, the way you'd normally use a threading needle. And now I'm gonna go through the stitches. So the last stitch that we knit was right here, and we're gonna go in the same direction, so clockwise, that we knit. But instead of knitting the stitches, we are going to go through them. This is picking the stitches up purlwise, so from the back direction. So we'll pick that stitch up, pick that stitch up. They're going onto the tapestry needle, and every couple stitches or after every needle, I like to pull it tight. We're then gonna move to the next needle, slide the stitches to the end, pick the stitches up purlwise, slipping them onto the tapestry needle. Pulling it tight. And we have now made it all the way around the hat. So I'm gonna tug that nice and tight so there's no risk of, you know, any gaps or anything. Even if you do end up with a little gap, you can fix it when you thread in your ends. So now that I've pulled that tight, I'm going to try to find the middle of the hat. You can see there's a little spot in the center here that all the stitches are centered around. And I'm gonna stick the needle right through that with the thread attached. I'm gonna go to the inside, flip the hat inside out, and pull that through. I'm gonna give it a tug again so it's nice and tight. And then now we are going to tie this up. There's lots of different ways to do this. This is just the way that I personally do it. So I'll find a stitch, I will poke the needle through, and then I will pull it so that it creates a knot. I will do that again on the same stitch, pull it through, making a knot. I'll then pick another stitch that's on the opposite side. You can see that the center is here. I'll thread the needle underneath a few stitches to the other side, and then I'll do the same thing over there. And honestly, it doesn't matter what stitches you pick, as long as you make a few knots, it's not going anywhere. So I've made another little knotted area, and now I need to do something with this leftover string. And different people give different recommendations on how they thread. This is something that'll kind of be personal preference. Some people like to go around, some people like to go down. I just kind of weave it through whatever stitches happen to be nearby. So you can go up and down, back and forth, but I'm just gonna tuck it underneath some of these stitches so that it won't go anywhere. So I'm threading it through those. I'll pull it through, I'll grab my scissors, and then I will just trim that, and ta-da, the end is hidden. I'm now gonna do the same thing with the yarn that's at the bottom. Sometimes something you can get is sort of a little bit of a gap between the first and the last stitch. And it might look like a problem, but it's really not a problem. You can easily fix it when you're threading your ends in. So there's a little gap right here. So I'm gonna go in one stitch past where the gap is, and I'm gonna pull the yarn through that stitch. That will pull these sections together and close that little gap that you get. Usually I'll pick a stitch that's, you know, one up from the bottom, and that's where I'll start making my knots. This is secure enough that you don't really need to knot it. I just prefer to do that because I'm paranoid about my hats coming undone, even though that's really unlikely to happen. So I'll give it like 2 little knots, a double knot. And then the way I like to do the end is you can see that you have the knit stitches that go up like this. I like to grab my needle and start threading up that line. So I'll go in and out. And it's up to you how far you want to go. 10 stitches, 15 stitches, you don't need to go very far. I'd say like 5 or 6 stitches. You pull that loose, and then you do the same thing that you did before. You lift it up, you cut the string, and then it is nice and tucked away. This is a inside out with all of the edges in. So I'm gonna flip it inside out now, right side out, and then I'm gonna fold that brim up. So now we have a hat that is totally finished and ready to wear. You can either leave the hat as it is, or you can add a yarn or fur pom-pom on top. And if you're curious about how to do that, I have another video on how to attach pom-poms. All right, happy knitting, guys. I hope that this tutorial helped. I would love to see your finished hat. And if you guys have any questions or anything along the way, feel free to reach out to me. I will be happy to answer any questions you have. All right, happy knitting. Bye.